Alright, so the next short story from Stephen King I'm going to talk about is from Skeleton Crew this time, and it's Word Processor of the Gods, which is going to take us back to Tales from the Dark Side, which we talked about when we talked about Sorry Right Number. And while Sorry Right Number was in the last season, I believe, this one is taking us back to the first season. I want to say it was the 8th episode. Eighth episode of the whole series, I suppose. And this is a concept that you've probably seen and heard of before, if not from this story. Like, before it, there was a Twilight Zone episode. I'm pretty sure it was also the first season of the Twilight Zone, called A World of His Own. And then it was actually tackled in a couple of ways in more of a comedic angle. There was a movie, I want to say, in the 90s with John Candy called Delirious that kind of touched on this scenario. And then much later on there was Ruby Sparks, which was like the indie comedy drama with Paul Dano. But this one kind of takes an approach you may not expect, especially coming from King, because you kind of get the idea that it might turn into one of those be careful what you wish for kind of stories, like a monkey's paw sort of thing. But the most interesting thing about the entire story is the fact that it doesn't go in that direction. So, going into the episode is directed by Michael Gornick, which is interesting because obviously when we talked about Tales from the Dark Side before, we talked about the fact that it was initially intended to be a Creepshow series after Romero made Creepshow, and then they wanted to kind of expand on it with that. But then they decided they wanted to make some changes to it and not make it exactly that, and kind of take maybe the comic angle out of it. So it became Tales from the Dark Side. But the interesting thing about this episode being directed by him is that he was, well, notably first, he was Romero's cinematographer on his well-known movies like Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, as well as stuff like Martin and Night Riders, I think he also worked on. And I'm pretty sure he shot Creepshow itself. But then he went on to direct Creepshow 2. So it was pretty much inevitable that it was still kind of a combination of Romero and King for these couple of episodes that were adapted from King's stories, that this guy would eventually show up. And so, of course, he did this episode. And as far as this one goes, in regards to the adaptation process, it's really kind of crazy that when we looked at Sorry Right Number in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, it's literally the script. Like, that's how he wrote it. He wrote it as like a teleplay, basically. But the thing about it is there were some changes made between the story for Sorry Right Number and the episode. What's so interesting about Sorry Right Number actually being written as a script in the book itself is that I think this adaptation is actually more faithful when you look at the two. This is like, the episode is like the story taken directly, like word for word, almost entirely. There's like one little segment that they add, but I'm pretty sure everything else is exactly the way it's written in the story. So whoever wrote the teleplay on this really barely had a job to do at all. So, there are some things that you'll notice that the episode can bring to life a little more, that the story kind of set up but didn't necessarily, couldn't really elaborate on in the way that like a visual medium could. We do get kind of a better look at just how awful the main character's wife is, and how the way she talks to the neighbor guy that comes over with him, and how she talks about how we kind of get some sloppy exposition in regards to what exactly happened to the main character's brother and his wife and child, with them dying in this accident, and the child, who's like this kid genius, being able to assemble this word processor that he's given the main character as a birthday gift prior to his death, almost as if he saw his death coming, in this really eerie way. But the thing about that is that the way the wife is built up and explains this, she's disgusted by the fact that they don't get any money for, really, as a result of their deaths, nor did they had to pay for a triple funeral themselves, and that's just unthinkable, and not because the family's dead. Like, that's the last thing that's awful to her in her mind. And seeing this dialogue come directly from her, while I do think it's a bit of sloppy exposition, it does also. There's only so much there's only so many ways you were gonna be able to get the information that's in the story, because obviously, as far as like being in text form, all a story is exposition. So to kind of explain what happened in this little 20-minute time window we have now, I do like the choice of giving that dialogue to the wife just to show how disgusted she is with the whole situation, thus showing off how much of a disgusting person she is in general. And then they also bring in the child, Seth, who is like the worst child ever, but we don't really get much of him in the story at all. We just hear that he ignores the main character, usually. And he acts like a piece of shit, like a normal, kid his age would, I suppose. But some of the things they add in this that work really well, that just kind of speak to that character perfectly with just a single line, is stuff like at some point in the episode, the phone is ringing, and he says, "Can you get that?" And from another room, we hear the kid say, "I'll get it later," as if that's how you would respond to a phone ringing. And so that line in general being added, I think, perfectly sums up that character, as well as God bless the actor that they hired to play Seth, because he does indeed have a supremely punchable face. So that was another sort of visualization they could bring to life that we couldn't quite get in the story, because he was just kind of on the side. So it's worth noting that the main character in this episode is played by Bruce Davison, who is amazing. He's done so many other great work. He's an Oscar nominee for his beautiful performance in Longtime Companion from 1989 or 1990. And he's perfect at playing this character that feels like there's just kind of such a warmth to him that it's kind of tragic, because with that warmth and the way he portrays it, it's so easy to imagine this guy getting walked all over by the people in his life, which pretty much makes it the perfect portrayal of this character. And so, going on that, we get the whole middle portion here when we see what the word processor looks like, how it looks like it's actually just been cobbled together by certain parts, but still miraculously works. But not only is it a miracle that it works, it's a miracle how it works, and what exactly it is that it does. And, yeah, obviously, whatever he types, or doesn't type, or types and deletes, will happen in real life in one way or another. So if he types, I'm married to my wife, if he types that and then deletes it, that whole thing is now deleted from existence. That whole statement. And he starts it off in a way that, and I do think the story pulled this off in a better way, but I can see kind of condensing it for the episode. But it's, the first time he notices this is just typing out that his wife's picture is in the room. And then when he deletes that, the picture disappears, and that's when he first realizes what's happening. In the episode, of course, it's just one of those picture frames that's like on a stand, and then it's just gone. But I like the further details in the story that make it seem significantly more supernatural, where it's a picture that is nailed into the wall, and it's like when he looks, like the nail was hanging on is gone, and there's not even a hole there where the nail was that the picture was hanging on. Just that whole thing was just deleted from existence. And I really love that moment in the story, but like I said, I can see where they would condense that for time constraints here. But then talking about, there is one segment that they added in the episode that kind of feels a bit more extreme than anything we see in the story, which is this, because the show that it's coming from is, for the most part, horror-themed, so naturally they're going to have to try to work a horror scenario into this, or a horror scene into this, because that's not really the kind of vibe that the story gives off, despite the fact that it comes from King. So they've added this scene because we do get the moment where he imagines his wife coming home after he's made the son disappear, and his wife accusing him of murdering him and all that stuff. But it's just really a brief moment in the story, where he just says, "Oh, she'll probably do that," at the end. But with the episode, they came up with this idea of making it this whole thing. It looks more like a scene out of Tales from the Crypt or something, like the early seasons of Tales from the Crypt. And it's this whole segment that's straight up played as horror. And it's not necessarily needed, as far as having a horror moment in this story. Like I said, as far as fitting in with the show and the vibe that the show has going on and having to kind of adapt it for that, just making it just one scene and throwing it in here and kind of really showing how exaggerated his imagination is of how this might go down, I do think it works to add it, and also in that fashion, so that's nice. And then there's stuff that they play in sort of a different fashion. I don't know if they necessarily meant to or not, but the moment where we're getting towards the end and he's trying to type up that, because the story goes into the whole thing in detail about how wouldn't it be great if because the girl he actually loved was the one that was married to his brother that died with them, with the rest of that part of the family. And it goes much more into a thing of how he's the one that kind of had her first, and then she went for the brother, and he kind of felt like it always got away from him because that was just another segment of his entire life of his brother making him miserable. And this was just kind of the peak of that. So this big moment when he's trying to erase history and rewrite it by erasing his own wife and son from existence and giving himself the wife and son that he didn't have but his brother did. And so it's this moment when he's trying to erase the word processor before it overloads and pretty much explodes. And just kind of like burst into flame, implode, whatever it's going to do. He doesn't even quite know, as explained in the story. But he knows that he has to type this as fast as possible before it gives out. And what's interesting is it's kind of played up more like suspense in the story, where like it's played up like a race where he really has to, play beat the clock in order to get this out before the word processor is gone forever. But what I really like the way the episode portrayed this, where you get a sense that he's trying his hardest to type it before everything's gone, but it's played more just kind of generally dramatically, rather than it's necessarily really playing up the, oh, I hope I get it in time. It's just such a whole, it just plays it up like such a dramatic moment in just kind of a general way, where it kind of starts at that point to go for the emotional beats that the ending ultimately gets to. So it's not like it's trying to transition from suspense to this sort of genuine emotional payoff. It sort of feels like the emotional payoff starts with that moment in the episode. So I really like the way that was pulled off. So now that we've explained what exactly he's doing, that kind of brings into question this story's outlook, or your outlook on this story, whichever, where there is a possible moral dilemma here that might sound like, because the story addresses this in a way that the episode, I guess, just doesn't have time to, but where it's like he does actually stop and take a moment like, wow, I'm literally like, I am basically killing them doing this. I am basically, or at least his son anyway. His wife could just be somewhere else. But his wife is deleted from existence, and he takes that entire life away from his brother in order to do this. And there's obviously something really there's something skeevy about this, sure, despite the fact that it's a happy ending, as it were. But the thing about that is, and how extreme that may seem when you think about it, but the thing is, well, for starters, you talk about the sort of angle it's taking on, where we talked about how it seems like it might be taking on the be careful what you wish for sort of thing, but it's not. It's more on and there's a blatant line at the beginning of the episode that spells this out, which is, it seems to be playing up more on the whole when bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people, and how often that seems to happen in the world and how much it sucks, but there's really nothing you can do about it. And it's like being able to right that wrong in this one time and actually have like I said, seeing as how they are, his wife and son are a piece of shit. And yeah, it probably does seem extreme to blank them out of existence just for being pieces of shit, and not for something more drastic, but just in kind of a general way. I do think also there is a bit of a... I mean, coming from King, you can imagine there's got to be sort of a unintentional morbid sense of humor in this as well. And so taking that into account also, it's easy enough to accept the touching ending that it's going for. And like I said, I think the thing that makes the happy ending work so well is that it's so unexpected, because it's a guy playing with such a moral dilemma. It's just all the tropes have been set up so much that you just keep expecting that this guy is going to pay for this in some way. But it's kind of, we're dealing with a guy that has paid for enough already. And so it's like, we're going to give him this. And it's like, it may not be totally morally, you know, upstanding, but it just gives something to this guy. And then when you take it on that, and the fact that the kid, Jonathan, that built the word processor, actually gets to live, then there's something to that. So, yeah, and like I said, I think the fact that that moral dilemma is there is kind of where, you know, the fun of the story comes in. You don't necessarily have to completely let it off the hook and say, oh, what a happy ending. But I mean, the door is there if you want to. You can take that route, absolutely. Which is the route I choose to take. So, yeah, you know, sometimes, you know, good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, and fuck the bad people. And that's basically what this story seems to be saying, so that's the approach we can take. So I can appreciate that. So, yeah, like I said, this is one of the more direct adaptations that we've talked about, where it feels like it was taken right off the page and just put on the screen. And it works quite well. This was a good story to be able to do that with. And I like the fact that they, you know, had the presence of mind to not make really much of any changes, and just made, you know, one or two here and there, whether it was a line that works, or a scene that kind of sets off a tone that it has to, you know, be in another series with, but it still works regardless. So, yeah, they really did well pulling this one off, and casting Bruce Davison as the lead, I think, was a big part also in just how well this was able to be pulled off, and how we feel for the guy, and just are able to just kind of go along with the events that happen. So, yeah. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a feature-length movie, feature-length adaptation. It's going to be the first story in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, if you remember what that is. So, which was adapted into a pretty fun movie, so that should be fun to talk about. So, on top of this, we've got the more Versus stuff with my brother coming, and reviews at some point will happen, like one of those big sort of videos where it's like a bunch at a time, to kind of play catch up, and then we'll see where we are. So, until all that stuff, I think that's it.